Good morning, boys and girls. We are in a series called Lessons from the Desert. Can anyone remember what lesson number 1 was? Lesson number 1?
Hannah and Penina, his wives.
No, lesson number 1 from the book of Numbers that we've been doing.
I was talking about my Sunday school class.
Lesson number 1 was God's plan you can't see is still better than your plan you can see. There will be a test next week on lesson number 1, and today, lesson number 2. Lesson number 2. You cannot do God's will your way. Is the customer always right? Recently, I stumbled upon a website called notalwaysright.com. It's a safe place for workers in the service industry, restaurants, hotels, clothing stores, etc., to tell their stories about the cranky customers they encounter. I read several of the stories and found myself siding with the writers. The customer isn't always right. Here's just one of the stories. The setting is a restaurant where it's normal to substitute a side for a different side, or even a side for an additional drink. A customer walks in and orders a meal but says, "Instead of fries, I think I would like an additional drink instead." "Not a problem, ma'am," the man behind the counter replies. The meal arrives, and the customer leaves happy. A few minutes later, however, the customer storms back in and declares, "I just ordered a meal from here and I didn't get any fries." The man behind the counter tries to explain to her that she substituted her fries for an additional drink. "Most of the time when I come here and I substitute the fries for a drink, I still get the fries," she protests. The man behind the counter holds his ground. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Occasionally we do make mistakes due to lack of attention, perhaps. But that doesn't mean you can still get the fries for free." The customer, now irate, yells over her shoulder as she exits the restaurant, "Well, I wouldn't have even come here tonight if I'd known you would be paying attention." It may be hard to come to grips with, but the customer isn't always right. It's not our fault, though. You know, it's really not our fault. We live in a culture that promotes choosiness. Burger King's slogan boasts, "Have it your way." Whataburger declares, "Just like you like it." L'Oreal's slogan, the shampoo company, says, "Because you're worth it." Eventually these slogans seep into our subconscious. We begin to tell ourselves, "Hey, I am worth it. I will have it my way." It may be an appropriate attitude when it comes to food, hair care products, and other material things. But the problem is when that same attitude slips into the church and our relationship with God when we begin to treat God and the church as if they were just employees in the service industry. And when we don't get it our way, many leave the church irate, yelling over our shoulder as we exit. When it comes to their relationship with God, the Israelites can also be a cranky crowd of customers. We turn today to Numbers chapter 14, verses 39 through 45. Numbers chapter 14, verses 39 through 45. When Moses reported this to all the Israelites, they mourned bitterly. Early the next morning, they set out for the highest point in the hill country, saying, "Now we are ready to go up to the land the Lord promised. Surely we have sinned." But Moses said, "Why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites will face you there. Because you have turned away from the Lord, He will not be with you, and you will fall by the sword." Nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the highest point in the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp. Then the Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah. This is the word of the Lord. In the previous verses, God had already told them, you will not be getting into the promised land. You will wander this desert for 40 years until this generation passes away. Your children will inherit the promised land instead. And yet, the people assume that they can still enter the promised land. Why is that, I wonder? It's not that they're unrepentant. They acknowledge their wrongfulness. In verse 40 they say, "Surely we have sinned." It's not that they're stubborn. After all, they could have dug their heels in and gone on back to Egypt like they had previously threatened. Perhaps it's that they're naive. They believe a simple, "Whoops, sorry," will suffice. But it doesn't. Moses even warns them this will not succeed. He says they ignore him, and as soon as they step foot into the promised land, here come the Amalekites and here come the Canaanites to beat them down. It was a hard way to learn lesson number 2. You cannot do God's will your way. I don't know what the problem was for these Israelite people, but I know what the problem is for us. The problem for us is that subconsciously we are affected by our consumer culture. We act like customers standing at the religion counter, demanding promise, demanding provision, demanding blessing, demanding answers. We want God and all that He promises, but we want it our way. But God will not bless any efforts, even if those efforts are in pursuit of His will. You cannot do God's will your way. So the challenge for us this morning is to reformation. If we want to do God's will God's way, we need to reform three things. First, we need to reform how we approach God. Second, we need to reform how we see ourselves. And thirdly, we need to reform how we go about doing God's will. The actual methods that we employ. So first, if we're going to do God's will in His way, then we need to reform how we approach God. The Israelites seemed to approach God in the same way that you or I would approach a computer. If I just input the right formula, then voila, He will spit out the right results. That works well for computers. Not so much for God. As we read, the Israelites recognize their mistake. They admit they are wrong, but it seems rather offhandedly. Just like my 3-year-old son, Beckham, they've gotten really good at saying the right thing, whether they mean it or not. Sorry, God, we were wrong. Can we go into the promised land now? As one commentator on this passage puts it, Israel still does not take God seriously or listen to Moses, His appointed representative. They will not enter Canaan until they learn their lesson. And that, he says, may take a long time. It seems to me that they need to relearn how it is one should approach this God. In 1923, Jewish philosopher Martin Buber authored a small but influential book entitled I and Thou. I and Thou. The entire premise of the book was to address how people approach God. Buber suggested that we move away from approaching God as I, it, and that we start to approach Him as a person. A person that you are in a relationship with. You cannot have a real relationship with an it, but you can have a real relationship with a thou, or a you, or a he, or a she. Theologian Roger Olson describes the relationship in terms of a husband and wife. Think about the relationship between a husband and wife. If I want to know what my spouse wants me to do, On Saturday, Olson writes, I don't plead with her for a detailed list of projects and directions. I enter into conversation with her about my plans and hers, what needs to be done that I don't know about, and how I might use the time, talents, and tools I have to be helpful. And this is exactly what God wants from us. A real, mutual relationship. In the words of Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, who's talking about, he's answering the question, who is a person? What is a person in the Old Testament? And this is what he says. The human person in the Old Testament is a person in relation to Yahweh. That's what a person is. A person who lives in an intense mutuality with Yahweh. So if we ever want to do God's will in God's way, we must start by approaching Him the same way that you would approach another person, another being, not as I, it. Not as a giant computer that you pray the right thing or you say the right thing and He spits out these magic results. No, but as I, thou. Because lesson number 2, you cannot do God's will your way. Second, if we want to do God's will His way, we are going to need to reform how we see ourselves. What every Old Testament commentator points out is that God is the protagonist of the story. God is the main character of the Old Testament. God is the hero. Every Old Testament commentator starts from there. And the Israelite people, and not just this time, by the way, but it seems to be a plague throughout their history, the Israelites believe just the opposite. They start to believe that they are the heroes. The Promised Land is for us. They forget their role in the story and they start to make something bigger of themselves. It's easy to forget the king when we're busy building our own kingdom. At a reception honoring musician Sir Robert Mayer on his 100th birthday, elderly British socialite Lady Diana Cooper fell into conversation with a friendly woman who seemed to know her well. Lady Diana's failing eyesight prevented her from recognizing her fellow guest until she peered more closely at the magnificent diamond jewelry and realized that she had been talking to Queen Elizabeth the entire time. Overcome with embarrassment, Lady Diana curtsied and stammered, "Ma'am, ma'am, I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't recognize you without your crown." It was so much Sir Robert's evening, the Queen replied, that I decided to leave it behind. Perhaps it would be helpful if we recognized who all of this belongs to and also leave our crowns behind. It's easy to forget the king. when we're busy building our own kingdom. But you were not called to build your own kingdom. You were called to be servants of the one true King. We need to reform how it is we see ourselves, because lesson number 2, you cannot do God's will in your way. Thirdly, if we are going to do God's will His way, we are going to need to reform our methods. The Israelites assume that they can build God's kingdom, but in their own way. They half-heartedly repent and then declare, now we are ready to go up to the land the Lord promised. But only disaster results. They're not the only people in history to make this mistake, by the way. The rally cry during the Crusades was, God wills it. God wills it. In 1095, the Council of Clermont met, and Pope Urban II pleaded with Western Christians to recapture the Holy Land, which had been conquered by the Turks. Western Christians at the time honestly believed that they were doing God's will, which is debatable amongst historians today and Christians. Debatable. But the method that they sought to do God's will was deplorable, which isn't so debated these days. What followed was centuries of bloodshed, rape, and pillage, not only of Muslims, but of Jewish people as well, not only of soldiers, but of innocent civilians, women, and children. But God wills it. God wills it. Did He, though? And all of this resulted in very little success. In fact, the very last battle of the Crusades, centuries later, was won by the Muslims. Very little success was found, but it has severely damaged relationships between Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people even to this day. The Crusades stand as an appalling example of trying to do God's will in the wrong way. And just like the Israelites, just like we read, the result of doing that is always disaster. Jesus even warned us against this mistake in Matthew chapter 7. Verses 21 through 23, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons? And in your name perform many miracles?' And I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you evil doers. When we are trying to do God's will, it's not enough just to try to do His will. We also have to do it in God's way. The end does not justify the means. The end determines the means. So what is the right way? What is the right way to do God's will? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is the way. Jesus is the end. And Jesus is also the means. If our methods are ever contrary to the character of Christ, contrary to the Jesus that we read in the Gospel, who is the most complete revelation of God that we will ever know, then we need to reform those methods. At least we do. If we ever want to do God's will in God's way, God will not bless our efforts if we don't. The result is always disaster. Because, lesson number 2, you cannot do God's will your way. At a meeting in Massachusetts, a speaker who had just delivered an urgent appeal to a group of young people to accept Christ was asked this startling question from a young woman there. Sir, she asked, I would like to know how we can be Christians and at the same time have our way. The speaker's answer to the young woman was simple. You can't. The speaker knew it. The Israelites would come to learn it. We would do well to learn it too. Lesson number 2. You cannot do God's will your way. Lesson number 3.